Morning, Bill. How are you?
Good. Doesn't it feel good, though, to be sitting here and not in the middle of a heated district attorney race?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Because there's a lot of action in Herkimer County these days.
Yes, there is.
It has been crazy. So, all right. Well, it's good to have you in. And you have to be relieved somewhat that this, probably a great deal, that this has come to, you have resolution on this from Friday.
Yeah.
A word of life case we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm very happy. The thing that we were concerned the most about was the trauma that we were putting the children through.
Yeah.
Obviously, Christopher, the surviving son, and then his sister, and just the way that certain things got reported when we went through the first trial. So that added to the trauma, especially for Christopher. So, we're kind of glad. I mean, it's a tough situation because you basically have one whole family that's been ripped apart, been a victim of a homicide, and also been participants in a homicide. So it's definitely an interesting case, that's for sure.
So, and you also are avoiding the big media, national media coverage, because that, had you gone to trial, this would have been, they would have done, well, they would have made it into a media spectacle, there's no doubt.
Yeah, definitely. Throughout the course of the prosecution of it, the national media at different times showed up. I know it did make People magazine. At the early stages, I was being called by a lot of different national news outlets. So
I was curious about the part where the judge said, well, there were 4 left, right, going into Friday, and they had 2 weeks. It seemed interesting, almost like in class where you say, all right, all you kids, one of you fails, you're all failing. I mean, that was an interesting element of pressure that he placed on them.
Actually, that was me and my office putting that pressure on.
Got it.
Our philosophy was that these 4 people acted together in kind of in the same type of a role in causing the death. They didn't do any of the actual whipping with the cord. But they, obviously the pastor was the person directing the counseling session, getting the parents and Sarah Ferguson whipped up into a frenzy. And then the other ones actually did strike the boys, kind of held them at bay, and also, kind of were inciting, I don't want to say a riot because it wasn't really a riot, but they were inciting the anger and the animosity throughout the incident. And the other reason was, it was more of a legal reason. There were certain things that would come in against Joe Irwin, or that would come in against Linda Morey, that we thought would be important for the jury to understand the overall situation.
Yeah.
For example, Linda Morey, in her confession, actually says that at some point during the evening, she said, we need to get Luke to the hospital. He's in terrible condition. That is something we could not prove in Sarah Ferguson's case because Sarah Ferguson wasn't present for that comment.
Got it.
But that was something we felt that, would be something that could show that they knew what shape Lucas was in. And actually, that was the problem I had with Sarah Ferguson. The judge said, how did Sarah Ferguson even know that he was in bad shape? So, so that was something we thought was important. Joe Irwin, his cell phone was an incredible piece of evidence for us. That would have been very helpful. It also kind of sets the stage for things that didn't really happen that night, but led up to it.
Yeah.
And he also gave a very lengthy confession.
I want to get a little bit of the early on. There was talk about, and these were all rumors at the time. There was talk about some form of touching, and you guys were really strong on saying it didn't. It didn't happen. Be careful what you're hearing. You and I actually had a conversation specifically about that. Yeah. But then he gave testimony that seemed to allude that something happened, but it was interesting how it dropped there. Can you just paint a little bit of a picture for us on what really went on there and
sure.
what really did happen?
Sure, I'll try.
Okay.
Well, first of all, the one thing I did want to, and because of the gag order, I was never able to come on and talk to you or anybody else after that information came out during the trial. But I know one thing that was getting spread around is that somehow or another we were misleading the public. That's absolutely not true. When we all were interviewed initially, and when that first barrage of information was coming out, which was coming from one of the defense attorneys, he was going around telling everybody that the 2 boys had molested these 4 children, and that's the reason for it. What we had done at that point was we had actually conducted examinations on 3 of the 4. One of the little girls wouldn't let us do an examination on her, but 3 of the 4 children we actually did, examinations on. There was no sign of trauma in, immediately before that, or for that matter, there was no sign that they'd ever been abused. So without getting too graphic, and I can just tell you from past history, we had a case here in Oneida County where a little girl was molested or raped, and she ended up in surgery to have her parts sewn back together.
Wow.
So that kind of trauma to a young child, typically, I mean, not typically, you always see there's signs. There was none. As a matter of fact, there was no signs of any trauma in the past or anything when it came to that type of molestation. In addition, the children that could speak were all interviewed. And they were specifically asked, did, your Uncle Luke and your Uncle Christopher inappropriately, I mean, they don't use the words you and I would use, molest or rape or whatever, but did they have bad touching with you? And the children that could talk all denied it. The 2-year-old who could not speak, once again, she was one that through the course of the night they were confessing to, according to Debbie Leonard, the mother, that they had raped her the night before or 2 nights before. She was in her crib. She was bleeding. All of these things that was totally inconsistent with the physical evidence we were seeing, and all the children were denying it. So that was like what we were trying to, and then once again, the other problem always is when I have a case that's pending before we go to trial, I have to be careful what I say because I can't put too much evidence out there because it's unethical. So that was where the problem lied. We knew how the rumor got started because the boys did confess to these things. We knew that. But when I actually interviewed Chris, I said to him, I go, did you admit to these things? And he said, absolutely. And I go, why would you possibly admit to these things? And he said, because I would have said anything to get them to stop whipping me, because he was being whipped in the genital area. As males, we all know how painful being hit there is.
Can't even think about it.
I can't imagine being whipped there 20, 30 times. So, but obviously there was some testimony that came out in the trial about, there was Grace testified at the Sarah Ferguson trial that Luke had said to her that he had peeked in the shower when she was in the shower. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I mean, once again, you have.
And what did he end up admitting to? He admitted something.
Oh, they admitted to a lot of things. They admitted to raping these children.
But on the stand, what did he?
Oh, Chris made an admission that he had inappropriately touched the children. The problem that we have with that, and
what does that mean, though?
Exactly. And here's the thing: it's not a defense in the case, so we couldn't get into it. And I had specifically asked him before he took the stand, did you ever, put your penis inside of any of your nieces and nephews' rectums or vaginas? And he denied that.
Got it.
So the problem that we have with this case, and we never really pushed the issue because it wasn't something that we could. Let's put it this way. I was in a tough situation. I'm compelling Christopher to talk. I'm telling him you have to tell the truth. And then if I start asking him questions about what he did to children and he makes an admission, I have a whole Miranda violation. I have a Fifth Amendment, Sixth Amendment violations. I got all these complicated issues that people don't see from the surface. I will say this much in talking to him. One of the things the pastor was very good at doing was creating memories in people that never took place. And the way she would do that is she would tell people, and we actually have her on audio doing this to different people. She would tell people when they said they didn't remember something. She would say, well, God talked to me, or the Holy Spirit talked to me, depending on whoever she chose in this counseling session or during service. And she says, and he told me that this happened. And the reason you don't remember it is because you're being possessed by a demon. And a demon is controlling your ability to remember. And so I know what happened. You just can't remember it. You need to cast off that demon. You need to remember this.
Wow.
So now people are going, wow, I don't remember that happening, but you know, the pastor says that it did, and we believe her, and that's the problem with this group, like a lot of other groups, and people like to call them cults or whatever. But these type of groups where you blindly follow the leader, and whatever the leader says is right, you believe it's right, and whatever the leader says is wrong, you believe it's wrong, unquestioned.
And it's interesting. The public wants to. I think the public really wants to know. Boy, did these boys do something to these children? At the end of the day, though, for you, and in terms of the trial, from a legal aspect, they could have done all the things that were said, and this does not justify what occurred here.
That's why we didn't get into it at the trial, because as the judge was telling us a little bit during the trial, but in the back, he goes, don't even waste your time, because I don't want to hear it, because it's not a defense. So we didn't go down that road. But from the physical...
That's why, from our standpoint, when we were watching... It came up, but it stopped, and we all kind of wondered, why did that happen? So basically, it's the judge saying it's not going to change anything here.
Exactly. But from what we do know from the physical examination of the children, from what the children said, there's no indication that the boys actually molested them. Now, whatever, I don't know what Christopher's talking about, but I do know this from different things that we know on the way that the pastor would talk to people. She redefines the word molestation, okay? And she gets these boys to believe certain things are molestation that you and I would not believe, okay? So, for example, one of the things that she and Sarah Ferguson both made a big deal over was at some point in time, Luke came up behind Christopher one time, horsing around like teenage boys do, and put him in a bear hug. And because the bear hug was from behind, he was molesting him because of the way that the body touches it. Now, I'm sure, and from anybody that knew Lucas and Christopher, all the people I spoke to, Christopher is a very, very much of a young man who he's very quiet. He likes his own personal space. He's very he's hard to talk to because he's not like you or I who engages people in the conversation. He looks at you, he answers your question, and moves on. He doesn't like anyone in his personal space. From everything that I've heard about Luke, Luke was the opposite. He was the jokester. He was the one kidding around. He was the life of the party kind of a kid. And so he was the big brother. I'm a big brother. Now I go back and I think about the things I did to my poor sister. I mean, from throwing water on her, but that's what big brothers do. Pushing her in the lake. I mean, different things. And what
that could have very well could have been, with the wrong scenario and the wrong situation, someone could twist that and turn it into something.
That's what Tiffany would do. She would twist all these things. So here's one of the things that I think was twisted with Chris, and that is this. These boys at times were required or forced to change the diaper of these children. And if you were to look at the body parts as you were changing the diaper, that would be considered a form of molestation because you were looking at them. You shouldn't have been looking at them. Now, anybody that's changed a diaper, especially on a little girl, knows that if the little girl had a bowel movement, and it's a mess.
You're not going to miss. You
got all over the place, and so I just don't know. But I know that was the one thing that he said is that I had to change their diapers. And so I suspect that whether he looked at it or whether he was told because he looked at them when he was changing their diaper that was a form. I don't know. I didn't get into it with him, but I do know this. When I was interviewing him, he made a comment that I thought was very telling about the manipulation and mind control that was over him. When I asked him, "Did you ever, molest your?" He was like, "No," and then he like stopped out of like no place and looked at it. He goes, "Unless I blacked out," and I said to him, "What?" And he goes, "Unless I blacked out." I go, "Chris, have you ever blacked out?" He goes, "No." But it's kind of the way the pastor would talk to these people. Once again, it's that blacked out by the Spirit. Yes. And, and so that's, and when I was talking to him, he said something else that I thought was very telling about that comment. And I was pushing him, I would say, quite a bit to realize that the pastor might not have been as holy, and that maybe there was issues about her that him and his family should understand.
Yeah.
I think my comment was, I'm fairly certain she doesn't speak to God. I think that's what I said.
Yes.
And
or at the very least, God's not speaking to her.
Right. There's not a conversation going on, at least in my opinion. So, and he looked at me and he said, "You are trying to tell me something that my entire life I was told was the way things are."
Yeah.
He goes, "This is hard for me to understand." And that's the problem here. You have a young man who for 18 years of his life was taught certain things. And whether it's this situation or anything, I mean, we see it with people that are raised in a very racist or a very anti-government. They grow up that way.
The little kid that's out there holding up the sign, the anti-gay signs. I mean,
because
he wasn't born that way.
Right.
But I find that just like you did, we try to take situations and scenarios and apply them to our own lives and our own memories. And when something like this comes up where it just doesn't make any sense at all, it's hard for us to understand because we can't find anything in our memory banks that apply. But if you think about it, think of how you see it in family court all the time. Little kids, we have parental alienation that goes on. Kids are brainwashed, and it's done very easily to kids. But what if you were that? What if it was like that from your childhood all the way up?
Right.
You wouldn't shed that at age 15, 16.
No.
It would take a lot.
One of the things that why we thought the children's interviews were important was they denied that Luke and Chris touched him in any way inappropriate. They denied any bad touching from them. But they did tell us that there was inappropriate things that happened to them by their own mother. So it's one of those things where when a child doesn't tell you anything, you have no barometer. But they told us that their mother spanked them, that their mother hit them with, as they described it, I would call it a paint stick because they would say it was a stick with paint on one end. But so they were making admissions to us, or at least telling us certain things that would lead us to believe that something had happened to them in a negative way. So And that was against their mom. So why not talk about their uncles if their uncles did anything? So once again, that's one of the things that we look at when we're interviewing people. But it's I think as Grace said during an interview before she took the stand with Lori Lisi, she said if Luke and Chris would have just told us how they got into that apartment, the beating would have stopped. And that was the problem. They didn't get into the apartment. They were telling them that they went under the door, that they broke the lock. They kept up making all these stories up
to get it to stop.
Because they, as Chris said, I just would say anything.
Yeah.
They told them they climbed in the window. Well, it's a 2.5-story building. There's they said we used a ladder. They go, we don't have a ladder that tall. No matter what they said, that Tiffany continued, that's not true. Tell me the truth. And they couldn't tell the truth because the truth was they didn't do it. And saying we didn't get in there wasn't the right answer that night.
Talking to Scott McNamara, the district attorney in Oneida County, on the case of the Word of Life case, which came to a conclusion on Friday. We'll break, come back, and can you hang for just a few more minutes? We'll talk some more. I do want to tell you our free money question of the day. We'll take caller number 3 at 736-0186. Caller 3 will give you that chance during the break, and then come back with Scott McNamara. Coming up, it's our free money question of the day from the Hobica. Something you could enjoy. We're giving away Hobica's money today. That's funny.
That's great.
Yeah, don't you love that? All right, we'll do that when we come right back at WIBX.